Hello, welcome to the latest episode of Harmonious World. My name is Hilary Robertson. For this episode, I'm joined by Sean Friar and Michael Mizrahi. They are from NOW Ensemble, a group of composers and performers creating effervescent and genre-busting chamber music for the 21st century. It really is a spectacular album. The ensemble features flute, clarinet, double bass, piano, and electric guitar. The NOW Ensemble has won awards since its inception in 2004 and has worked closely with many leading composers. I hope you enjoy listening to my conversation with Sean and Michael. Hello and welcome to Harmonious World, and I'm delighted to be joined by Sean Friar and Michael Mizrahi. Is that right, Michael?
You got it.
Excellent. Right. From NOW Ensemble, and the album Before and After is out now. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
Excellent. Well, can you tell me about it? So the compositions are by Sean, and Michael, you're the pianist. Is that right?
I'm the pianist and the director of the ensemble, and NOW Ensemble is a quintet, and it's a somewhat unusual instrumentation, so I'll list them here. It's a flute, clarinet, double bass, electric guitar, and piano. And we've been playing together for, it's almost 20 years now. It's kind of hard to imagine that number. And we've been working with Sean for about the last 10 of those, on and off. And he wrote us a piece about 10 years ago that we programmed on an album we released back then in 2011 called Awake, and loved working with him so much, and the sound that he got out of our ensemble, that we commissioned him to write a longer piece, and that grew into this project. It's now a full album worth of his music.
Is the instrumentation because the five of you enjoy playing together and that's just what you play, or was it a very deliberate choice?
That's a great question, and I would say it's actually more the former than the latter. I mean, it grew out of a group of composers who were hanging out at the Yale School of Music, where we all went to grad school, and there was just this kind of idea. I think it even came out at a party. It was like, what if we just wrote a piece for the five of us, and it was that instrumentation. And it was one of those things that you imagine would just kind of work as a lark one time. And we not only enjoyed playing together, but we thought the music sounded pretty good for that combination. And I would say what's kept us going for as long as we have is that that combination of instruments, there's a surprising range of what's possible. There's kind of a rhythm section in a way with electric guitar, bass, and piano, but there's also melody instruments. There are different timbres that combinations of instruments can produce, and the electric guitar is kind of a wild card with so many options. And so we found that composers, we've worked probably with over 100 composers, and they've each approached the five of us in a different way.
Right. So that was my next question. So Sean, how did you approach this very, very unusual quintet? I think it's a quintet for the 21st century, because you couldn't have had this before because of the electric guitar, and the combinations are really fascinating. So how did that work for you, Sean?
Well, that's a good point. There's not a lot of old repertoire to look at to get inspiration for how to write for these instruments. And I think what's really exciting about writing for the group is the same thing that's challenging about it, is that there are so many fresh combinations, as Michael alluded to. There can be a rhythm section. The group can very easily inflect toward rock music or toward jazz, depending how the electric guitar is playing mixed with the bass. And so there's a whole kind of world of coloristic opportunities that you don't necessarily get in a normal classical ensemble. In terms of how I wrote for it in Before and After, a lot of my composing I would say maybe the majority of the movements started with me improvising at the piano, kind of thinking about the ensemble and what kinds of colors could augment the things that I was doing on the piano. And I think you can hear that some of the movements, particularly something like Rally or the opening movement Chant, very much came out of the piano. And then the other way that I write for NOW Ensemble on this album and also on the earlier piece that Michael mentioned, Velvet Hammer, is thinking of the guitar as not just another member of the chamber ensemble, but as kind of the whole world of the group, that the rest of the performers kind of find their way into the sound of the guitar or find ways to augment it. And there's something very exciting about all the different colors that you can get out of the guitar, especially with the effects pedals. If you have a distortion pedal on, you can get all these, high frequencies that then the flute can blend really well with. Or if you use a delay pedal, you can get very cool effects between, say, guitar and piano. And so some movements, I would say, like the third movement, Spread, really look at the guitar as the central, like the entire world. And everybody else sort of becomes a part of it or picks up some part of the guitar sound and kind of makes it their own. So I guess to sum those up, I'm usually thinking about trying to create some kind of big hybrid texture with the group. Of course, they're all wonderful chamber musicians who can all play in beautiful ways in which their instruments sound like themselves. But a lot of this piece is really interested in trying to find these sweet spots between the tones of the different instruments so that maybe there are moments where it would be hard to say who is doing what.
And actually, that is quite interesting because you do have to listen really carefully, because there are times when there's a sound, and it's not, you can't necessarily very easily identify which instrument is playing which note, or the melodies weave in and out.
I would say that's a really cool thing for me as a player for Sean's music, is sometimes I'm playing and my fingers are going down, but what I'm hearing is not what I expect because I'm being doubled or tripled by another instrument. And that's kind of a rare feeling in chamber music, and it's one thing I love about playing Sean's music.
And I think a lot of that comes out of the sense that, or my thinking that just because there are 5 performers playing at a given time, there aren't necessarily 5 layers. Often there's 1 big layer or 2 big layers, and so it's more common that something like what Michael said is happening, where they're not necessarily literal doublings, like you're just playing in octaves, but 2 or 3 people are kind of deployed on the same general idea. And it could come down not only to the direction they're moving, but the timbres they're playing with, the ornamentation they're using. And so it's very much about that hybrid result. I suppose one of the challenges for the musicians then is if they're just looking at their individual part, it's not always clear what the whole thing is until you hear it in context, or I guess you could look at the score.
Yeah. And there are also moments where something isn't playing, where there's the silence of whichever instrument isn't playing, and that's beautiful as well.
Yes, it was. I mean, when it's a piece as long as this one, almost 50 minutes, it would. Well, not only would it be exhausting for the performers to
Yeah.
never get a break, and they get a pretty good workout in this piece as it is. But just timbrally, it gets a little tiresome to be hearing the same colors all of the time, and I think. Whether it's leaving players out or trying to find different combinations of instruments, which could be, say, the difference between the flute and the clarinet doubling in octaves where the flute's above the clarinet or below the clarinet. All of these are different colors, and I think trying to find as much variety as possible in this group of instruments is important for such a long piece so that it doesn't just become homogeneous sounding by the time you get to the end.
And I'll add that there's a tradition of silence in music going back 200 or 300 years. It's not a new concept. One thing that's kept us going, working with Sean and also as an ensemble, is that we play as a quintet, and the music is written. Sean's entire piece is written for us as a quintet, so there aren't movements where instruments are out, but there are definitely segments where the scoring changes.
Talk to me about the composition and recording process. So how did it all tie together, and what happened in what order? I mean, obviously the composition was before the recording, but how much of the composition happened before you saw any of the parts, and then was there revisions, and what happened?
The ideas for the piece started probably in 2012 because after we had worked together on that first piece, we wanted to do something bigger, and so we applied for a grant, which we got. And at that time, it was a proposal for I think a 15-minute piece. And in 2017, we premiered what I thought was that piece, which were two movements, which are now the more or less the first and seventh movement of the piece. And we all liked the music, and we all felt like this does not seem like a complete piece. It was two slow, dark movements that, while interesting, were a little bit of a bummer, just put back to back because it was so dark. And so we both thought, like, yes, this is something that should be larger. And so then from 2017 through about 2020, we met, depending on the year, once or twice a year, for workshops where I would bring new music to them, and we would play through it. Some of them were completed movements, some of them were just sketches, some of them made it into the final album, some of them will be saved for another time or for never, but they didn't make it in. And we did performances of these. Often they were workshops at universities. And so, first they played a 15-minute version, then maybe a 25-minute version of the piece, then a 35-minute version. And then I think in 2020, we played what was close to the final version of that. And forget exactly when, but as it started getting bigger, I think we had an idea that this made sense to be its own album. And then, I don't know, maybe Michael, you could talk about the recording process.
Well, I just want to underscore how special and unusual it is to have had such a long back and forth with a composer. I mean, I would say even though we're an ensemble, and even though there are composers in the ensemble, we usually get completed pieces and then perform them. I mean, just, as kind of there's a tradition of that. But to try things out, and we would literally be sitting in a practice room saying, is this possible on the guitar? And then you always had to be careful. If you said it is possible, it was going to go in the piece. So you had to choose what you wanted to do carefully. We did get to that point, and Sean mentioned 2020, and of course we all know that in March of 2020 the world shut down. We were extraordinarily lucky that we got to that final workshop in February of 2020 where it was planned this way, that we would perform the piece at a festival and then go to the recording studio. And we did in fact do that for 3 days in February in Vermont, and completed the tracking of the album just before the world shut down. And as luck would have it, the editing process and the mixing and the mastering and all of those kinds of things that go into making an album are all activities that can be done remotely. And so we were able to complete the album over the course of the last year and a half and release it more or less on time. It was delayed a little bit because of the pandemic, but we did get it out in November of 2021.
Right. And it really, to describe, what genre would you put it in if you had to?
Do we have to?
No, well, I don't think you do actually. If you're talking about Grammy nominations and things like that, it's very difficult to shoehorn this into something because the nature of it is classical, but the instrumentation changes that a little. It's more film music than sort of concert hall type music, but where would you put it? Sean, where would you put it?
Well, I think you did a lovely job describing all of those different influences. I mean, in a way that's not a very fun answer. I would put it or classify it as classical music. And I think the biggest reason for that is that, although, now that I'm already questioning myself, I was thinking it could be in the genre of classical music, but also a concept album in that it's really something that is meant to be listened to from beginning to end. There are a few movements that I think work fine as individual tracks, but a lot of it I think the most benefit, the most kind of interrelationships and big narrative arc that you see is from beginning to end, and that is something that I think is a hallmark of most classical music. This idea that ideas and their relationships to each other develop over time in complex ways, and that you're rewarded for being there from the beginning. You can't simply drop the needle. So I think from that formal perspective, it is classical. But in terms of the sound world, the harmonic language, it's sort of classical, but I don't know that it's more classical than it is, say, rock influenced. I mean, it's been interesting to see this album get played on, a variety of radio stations, which maybe this is the best way to tell what genre it is. Some of them have been classical, some of them have been jazz, some of them have been ambient music. Different movements seem to get placed in different genres. But yes, this is one of the challenges now, is that there's a lot of classical music where there's so much intermingling between jazz or indie rock or electronic music. Of course, there is, maybe classical music that's still orchestral, that feels very purely classical, but this is definitely not an album like that.
Yeah. Michael, have you got anything to add?
Well, I think this speaks to how we consume music in the 21st century as well. There's not, at least in the States, we used to have this record store called Tower Records, and you would go and browse, sometimes different rooms of the store depending on the genre. And those unfortunately all closed down, but we're all consuming music online, and it's all coming at us from every direction, and you can jump from one thing to another so quickly. I think you mentioned Grammy nominations earlier, and of course we'd love to be considered for a Grammy, but some of those categories are a little bit outdated, I think. There are so many albums like this that just don't fit neatly into one of those places, and who's to say that one person's conception of this music as classical is someone else's conception of what classical music is. I mean, I think that kind of creates certain boundaries that aren't there even before you turn on the music. And it doesn't reflect how we listen to music these days anyway.
No, exactly. And I think part of the issue with that we've got with Before and After is that it is, you need to listen to it from the beginning to the end. And how many people actually do that now? Most of it. Well, I don't listen to. I'm very fortunate in my job that I get to listen to lots of albums, and I can just listen to an album from start to finish, and it's great. But a lot of people are using a streaming service, and they're dipping in and out of here, there, and everywhere. And that, although that's good because it might mean that they discover something, they're not discovering the depth of a particular artist or a particular genre even. So that wasn't even a question, really.
Well, Sean, I wonder how you feel as a composer, knowing your music is being streamed, a little bit here, a little bit there, versus heard live in a concert hall, potentially.
I like the idea that people can discover this music passively. I think that's one of the challenges of classical music, is that if you have to know, I know this group or this composer, that's already a very small group of people. I do find it pretty frustrating myself when I listen to certain streaming services where I find something I like, and then instead of continuing on to the next track in the album, it skips to something that an algorithm thinks I'll also enjoy, and it's difficult to even find what I was hearing. Yeah, I mean, I guess I just try. It's not. I recognize that I think as musicians, compared to other art forms, we ask a lot of our audience to say, sit down for 45 minutes and listen to this, piece of visual art. You can just walk away if you're done. So I understand that it's not practical for a lot of people to just commit to 45 minutes if they're not sure it would be something they'd like, which is frankly probably one of the reasons that we tried to release a single that we thought stood best on its own, but also encapsulated some feeling of the entire album. I hope they land on a movie that sounds good by itself. even in this, we're talking about streaming, but I'm involved in NOW Ensemble is involved in a new opera as well right now by a different composer, and that's about as long a form as you can get. And composers are writing in these long forms. There is an appetite for that,
And we haven't really talked about the themes of the work as well, but there are so many ways in which these larger scale works are engaging with contemporary non-musical themes that are compelling, and I think there is an audience for.
Yeah. Do you want to talk, Sean, a little bit about the sort of the themes behind the music?
Sure. So the general theme of the album is, I guess you could say, my imagining of the lifespan of civilizations. And I look at the structure of the album as kind of a series of vignettes of different moments, like hopeful beginnings, or nostalgia for a perceived golden era, or the feeling that perhaps we've crossed some threshold we really shouldn't have. All ideas that I think are somewhat relevant now. And the original idea came for this piece when I was living in Rome in 2011 and 2012. And Rome, compared to where I'm from, Los Angeles, is a city with a lot of history, and one in which it builds constantly on top of itself in such a way that you're very aware of what came before you, not only past individuals, but whole past cultures, ones that feel now very ancient and distant. And that somehow that idea sunk in, that you could be living in a place where simultaneously you feel like you're experiencing all of these different moments in a civilization's lifespan. And that idea, I think, kind of vaguely formed at first, was what got me started writing this album. And then it was one of these things where the more movements I wrote, the kind of clearer the message became, in terms of me wanting to tell a little bit more. It's not quite as explicit as a narrative, but something in which the listener feels, and definitely kind of an arc of history, even if it's still up to the listener to decide exactly what words or emotions they might want to ascribe to these different movements. And I suppose as the project went on, and we got close to our recording session and COVID hit it, well, there weren't many things to be thankful for COVID, but at least when that happened, I felt confident that the themes of the album were not going to go out of style, even if it were delayed a bit.
Right. What future plans are there for NOW Ensemble, and for perhaps performing this live? Are there any plans?
Well, I mentioned for NOW Ensemble, we're working now on a big opera that's going to be premiered this fall, with one of the composers in the ensemble. Judd Greenstein wrote us this piece. That's also been in the works for about a decade and been workshopped, and it's been a wonderful process. And we'll be premiering that at Penn State University in Pennsylvania in October. We did get to perform before and after live in New York during one of the little low points in between Delta and Omicron, I think, the COVID. So we were able to get there to one of our favorite venues in Manhattan and play the work as kind of an album celebration right when the album came out this last fall. We're planning the next season, and a big work like this will always be a part of our touring program, and we'll be featuring it, I imagine, throughout the next several seasons as we get back on the road, as that's possible.
Yeah, very good. Well, thank you for your time. It's been amazing to talk to you. It's been really enlightening about this album and about how you work and everything. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Well, I hope you enjoyed listening to my conversation with Sean Friar and Michael Mizrahi from NOW Ensemble. The album we were talking about before and after is out now, and you can check out the links on the show notes. At the start, you're listening to Artifact, and now this is Done Deal, both from before and after. They're just little extracts from this wonderful album. Thank you for listening once more to Harmonious World. I apologise that there's been a big gap between some of my episodes recently, but we're back to whatever might be normal now, and I look forward to sharing with you some of the great interviews that I've been able to do over the last few weeks. So I hope this finds you well and you stay well. Thank you for listening to the latest episode of Harmonious World. My name is Hilary Seabrook, and it's a great delight to bring this series of discussions with musicians and composers and writers and all sorts of people to you. Obviously, there's no point in having a podcast if people aren't listening, and I'm very grateful to my listeners for doing so. Thanks also to Joe English for composing and performing this new theme tune. So wherever you get your podcast, you can leave a review. You can share this with your friends and family, either as a link or on social media and that sort of thing. I'd be really grateful for that. Don't forget that you can subscribe now. There's a link wherever you get your podcasts. So have a great week, and please remember why I started this, which is just to try and make the world a little more harmonious. Thanks for listening to Harmonious World.